Thank you for joining us today, and for everyone who's also joined us online. Thank you. Thank you. I'm Prima Madan, and I work with the Natural Resources Defense Council. And on behalf of NRDC, Ministry of Environment, Forest, Climate Change, Government of India, and United Nations Climate Change Global Innovation Hub, I welcome you all to this very pertinent and timely discussion on advancing action on extreme heat and cooling. I know we are already starting a little bit delayed from the previous panel, so without further delay, I'm going to invite Mr. Manish Bapna, our President and CEO, Natural Resources Defense Council, to give his welcome remarks and also set the context for our discussion today. Please.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. Manish Bapna, really wonderful to be with all of you here today. Just to say a few words of welcome. We're delighted to have... Are we okay? Delighted to have Mr. Ovais Sarmad, the Deputy Executive Secretary of the UNFCCC, Mr. Ayman Refaie, the Head of Carbon Credits from the Ministry of Environment here in Egypt, and my colleague, Ms. Dipa Bagai, the Country Director for NRDC India. What we hope to do today is really to focus on two critical interconnected issues. The first around extreme heat, and the second, the critical importance of cooling. These are issues that I think haven't yet received the level of attention that they deserve on the global stage. When we think about extreme heat, it's important to remember that 2 billion people will be exposed to extreme heat in a meaningful way by 2030 in a 2-degree world. Just let that sink in. Projections of tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people dying from extreme heat each year. It is an issue that has not yet received the scale or the level of attention that it deserves, given what it will mean for people in Egypt, in India, all around the world, even in the United States, even in Europe. A study just came out a couple of days ago that in Europe, 90,000 people will die each year by the end of the century if drastic action isn't taken to reduce emissions. This is a very significant issue. Cooling, we know, is absolutely critical. This is not an issue of comfort, it's an issue of survival. 2.8 billion people at the moment live in some of the hottest places around the world, but only 8% of them have conditioners, air conditioning. In India, cooling demand is increasing at the rate of 15 to 20% globally, but only 1 in 10 people actually have access to air conditioning. So we're seeing tremendous growth in the need for cooling, tremendous growth in the need to provide access to cooling, but how we do that in a way that is clean, inclusive, doesn't perpetuate the vicious cycle between greenhouse gas emissions and extreme heat becomes incredibly important. So how we look at extreme heat, how we look at cooling is at the heart of what this session today is about. The moral argument for why we need to do this is incredibly clear. The economic argument is also very strong. I was part of a global commission on adaptation that worked for 2-3 years on trying to quantify, among many things, the economic benefits of investing in resilience. The commission was co-chaired by Ban Ki-moon, Bill Gates, and Kristalina Georgieva, and we came out, one of the key findings was that investing in resilience resulted in benefit cost ratios of between 4-to-1 and 10-to-1. And that shouldn't be surprising. We know it makes strong economic sense to invest before something happens than afterwards. So the moral argument, the economic argument are critical. We know what the solutions are in terms of how to respond to extreme heat, how to actually deal with cooling. The challenge, the focus of today's conversation is on the how. How do we scale this at a level that's commensurate to the challenge? How do we look at scaling innovatively? That's what's at the heart of today's conversation, and we're delighted to have a number of distinguished speakers and panelists to explore this question. So with that, let me turn it back to Prima. Again, a warm welcome to all of you.
Thank you so much, Manish. I'm going to stand this side because I've been told the microphone's going to scream back at me again then. Thank you so much, Manish. I think what Manish said, scale, the word scale is extremely critical as we talk about both these climate stresses. And scale isn't really possible without partnerships. So who better to talk about partnerships than UNFCCC? So next I'll invite Mr. Ovais, Sarmad, Deputy Executive Secretary from UNFCCC, to please give his remarks.
Thank you very much, and it's a real pleasure to be here and share this discussion with such eminent colleagues and professionals in this field. And thank you, Manish, for inviting us from NRDC. Good to see other colleagues here, and Dr. Ayman from Ministry of Environment. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dipa. From UNFCCC, where we are, I'm not an expert in how to address the challenges of the global warming and how we remain cool. Right now, the way we need to remain cool is to get those negotiations done in a way that the world agrees to remain within 1.5 degrees. That's the best way. But then we also know we are living in an extremely volatile environment in every sense of the word, geopolitically speaking, but with the threat of climate impacts around the world. The recent NDC report that we published, it shows that we are totally off track. We will be something between 2.5 to 3 degrees by the end of the century. And we're already 1.1 now, and we're seeing the impacts. And every fraction of the degree from there onwards of warming matters. Now, what does that mean, matters? Every fraction of a degree translates into loss of lives. And I repeat that, loss of lives and livelihood around the world. And there is no global north, south, east, west, rich, poor. It's affecting everyone. So we have a huge moral, ethical imperative to do the right thing. Everyone, everywhere, every day, we need to take action. And one, of course, like many other aspects, and thank you for zooming in, how we remain cool, especially in the urban areas, with the increasing temperatures around the world, and especially in mega cities. Cities that many of us come from. I come from Hyderabad in India, which is now 15 million, and we are feeling the impacts of it. And there is no quick fix solution to it, how to remain or provide the cooling in the cities that have grown, that have been built over hundreds of years. And it's impossible to tear it down, break it apart, and then retrofit it. So there have to be innovative solutions, and that's why I'd like to thank our colleagues in the Innovation Hub here, and in the UNFCCC we've established this hub to precisely go beyond the business as usual, break the boundaries, to look for solutions that are necessary to find really those kind of measures that would take us to the next stage, in a transformative way. Especially in the cases of urbanization, and almost 60% of the population is living in highly urban and unfortunately also in low-lying areas. So we need to adapt, we need to find solutions to it. And again, as I said, I do not have practical solutions, but I've been thinking about it, again, from a city like Hyderabad, and this is happening in many parts of the world, and including in Cairo, for instance. instead of expanding or congesting the city even further, there are satellite cities that are coming up in many, many parts of the world. And that is one definite way of addressing cooling or managing the growing temperatures in urban areas. So the satellite cities, which are better planned, which are better urbanized, more green, and with various innovative technologies that we have and are emerging. And that's where colleague Masamba and his team, they are bringing partners, and we are making those partnerships on a daily basis with far-reaching opportunities. So this is another very important thing. I mean, there is the doom and gloom and all the negative impacts, but the converse is also very true. In fact, much more energized, in fact, if we do the right thing, the opportunities and that are to be had, including employment, including reduction in the cost of renewable and deploying all of that. So that's where innovation comes in. And in this COP, I've come across now several innovation zones. In fact, there is a new zone that has been established in a place outside the COP venue that's called Innovation Hub, I think, or Innovation Zone. And I went there for an event, and I was surprised myself that every corporation and many governments are there showcasing what they're doing in terms of really breakthrough innovation. So I hope we can find ways and we can leverage those innovative technologies and mechanisms. But the key word, as also was said by Manish, is scale and pace. That is needed in relation to the urgency of what we are facing. So with that, back to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Sarmad. I think for highlighting the word innovations, I think we have to think of innovative ways of moving fast, moving with speed, and with scale. So I think we got 3 key words till now in the panel, which is wonderful. And with this, I will now move to the country where we are in, to Egypt. Thank you, first of all, for hosting us in this wonderful country. And I invite you, Mr. Honorable Ayman Refaie, Head of Carbon Credits, Ministry of Environment, Egypt. It would be wonderful to know from you what Egypt thinks of this challenge of heat and the actions being taken.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you. Actually, I'll talk practically. Let's talk about Egypt experiment with the Montreal Protocol, and the story started by we are signing, we are preparing ourselves through capacity building, laws, legislations, hard structure, hard and soft structure. Thank you very much. Hard and soft structure. We prepared a lot of people and actually started our awareness campaign. But let me don't deny that we used the whole tools of multilateral funds and the UN umbrella and the whole donors, even a lot of respectable cooling companies assisted us to nationalize our industry here, especially for the household devices, and which is the most useful. So we followed the whole rules, and I think the result started by almost reducing, if we link it, the GHGs by ozone. Till the moment we reduced around the figure 18 million GHG equivalent CO2 tons. Okay, So, let's complete the story. Within the cooperation with UNEP and UNIDO, we convinced our private sector, the biggest investors in this field, to change the technology of their industry and make their own capacity building for their laborers, and 2 or 3 of them already established technical schools to graduate the very smart and well-skilled laborers, top priority to work in their industries or manufacturers, and the rest of them are available for the other countries or for the same country to work in the services and as a private sector and the private center for repairing and maintenance and whatever it is. Okay, it's a job opportunity. So it means we reached the sustainable development concept. Now, if we are talking about implementation, time to action, I think we have to merge the whole UN agreement and conventions and whatever it is. By the end of ozone, we reached the GHG and the climate change as a result. If we started to change the gases which we are using now within the moment, Egypt could reach or could save more than 200 million tons of CO2. It means we can contribute in reducing the 2 centigrades, which we'd like to achieve. This is, I consider it as a success story, because the whole parties are joined together, truly, and they put all of their properties and they put one capability in one hand, which is the government of Egypt, which is already managed the story through semi-governmental unit. We call it ozone unit. It's a semi-governmental but we deal together in a very flexible regulations for the fast implementation. And what they need as a law or as a governmental regulation, we adjust this formula. So I think we, within the phases of phasing down or phasing out, for all the plans which we put and submitted to the convention secretary are implemented, and they, I think, appreciate it, and they already continued in supporting Egypt within the multilateral funds and the other entities under the UN. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Refaie. Yeah. I think, you made an important connection of talking about the Montreal Protocol and its connection with the climate treaty, because the current group of gases that we have to phase down are in terms of the global warming potential. So thank you for highlighting that connection that we have to be working towards. I will now turn to Ms. Dipa Bagai, our India Country Director for NRDC. She's going to share some remarks from India, from India's Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change on this particular topic. So over to you, Dipa.
Thank you, Prima. What I bring to you now is the message on heat and cooling from India. So heat is not only an inconvenience, but as Manish said, it's a deadly global health threat. Its impact is not only limited to health, but also it has adverse impacts on agriculture, marine ecosystems. They bleach the coral reefs, labor productivity losses happen, and serious economic impacts happen. We all know that, and we are bound now by some level of warming, all of us, and we need to build resilience to this increased level of threat. Combined with the challenge of rising heat is the challenge of access to cooling. Cooling is the most direct impact of global warming. And in India, we need to ensure access to cooling for, now mark this, 63 million rural poor, 110 million urban poor, and a growing lower middle income population of 885 million who may soon acquire a cooling appliance. I mean, just see the extent of this. So the demand is huge. We have to think of innovative ways of meeting this demand through the combined work of all of us in this room and beyond. I thank the Global Innovation Hub for making us think like this, think differently about this, and to our partners who are here. We in India have put in a lot of ambition into the India Cooling Action Plan. It was released in March 2019. It sets the target of reducing cooling demand, cooling energy demand, refrigerant demand, and providing thermal comfort. Now, thermal comfort is a very important word. Many of us don't realize it, but for those who are working in slums, in little houses, the hawkers, construction workers, for them, thermal comfort is very different from how we imagine it. I met someone from the US Building Council who was outside and said, yes, of course, air conditioning is so important. And I said, air conditioning is for a very, very small segment. It's something else. And we have started the implementation of the plan in the short, medium, long term. We are building on this plan and policies, looking for new ways of implementing solutions. Here, it becomes really important to look at things differently, not in the classic way of saying, okay, we need good air conditioning and perhaps better fans. It is now time to look at heat and cooling in a collaborative way and move towards a global compact on cooling. It's not something that is limited to India or Egypt or heat-stressed countries. As you mentioned, the US is equally vulnerable. I was in Europe this summer. Europe was extremely vulnerable. So India is ready to partner with other countries on heat and cooling action plans and work on strengthening preparedness, scientific expertise, robust communication programs, effective community engagement, that is very important, to implement these plans in a cohesive way and, as Prima mentioned, with speed and scale. Because we don't have a lot of time in which to be able to do this. The heat is relentless. I mean, Manish wrote a blog this summer, which was like this summer of no respite. It was the hottest summer ever recorded for us in India, the month of March. So I just want to end this part with the words of a poet. They are very poignant. And they are in Hindi. But many of us understand it. For those who don't, I will translate. Ghazab ki dhoop hai, sheher mein magar. The sun is relentless in this city. Dil kisi ka bhi pighalte nahi dekha maine. I have not seen hearts melt to see how this relentless heat is affecting me. It is time for us to make those hearts melt. That is why we are here. So let us jointly together take a pledge and make sure that we put our throbbing hearts into this, not just our words. That is the appeal. Thank you. I also want to thank all our speakers for the very inspiring words that they gave us. And now I'd like all of them to help us with the release of a fact sheet that NRDC and our partners, the Gujarat Energy Research and Management Institute, have put together. This highlights the impact of climate-friendly cooling technology, of cool roofs on energy systems. This study was published in a very well-known scientific journal, analyzes energy system effect on cool roof installation in the city of Ahmedabad, where we've got some really significant results, comparing a baseline year, 2018, with a near-term future in 2030. These are the kind of studies which really make us stand up and take notice. Overall, our study found that expansion of cool roofs from just 5% to 20% of total roof area could reduce 2030 cooling energy demand in Ahmedabad by 210 gigawatt hours relative to a future without additional cool roofs. That's a small innovation. I mean, Masamba likes to talk about this. He says you have to look at different ways of finding the solutions. The solution is not fans or air conditioning always. These are simple but solutions which have to be implemented in a very different way. And this is equal to 190,000 metric tons of avoided carbon dioxide pollution. This is important for those agencies which look at the numbers and agreed that the way of implementing this is very complex, especially for some organizations who look at it in a very technical way. But these are amongst the many different solutions we'll have to look at and find for making this change happen. So, given the fact that these kind of important, interesting facts are around, I would like our esteemed panel to share that fact sheet widely and beyond. Prima. Could I request the panel to please stand up for a picture showing the fact sheet, and then we release it way beyond this room and the message to go far and wide.
Thank you so much, all our esteemed guests. This has been a truly inspiring set of words for us to get started into our next segment of our event. We have senior experts with us to talk about solutions for expanding extreme heat and access to climate-friendly cooling. And aligned with India's theme for this COP, life, that is lifestyle for environment. So I invite our distinguished speakers to kindly come on the dais here, please. And we have with us today Mr. Amit Prothi. He's the Director General of Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure. Dr. Darmit Campbell-Lendrum, Head Climate Change and Health Unit at the World Health Organization. Ms. Seema Paul, Program Director, Sequoia Climate Foundation. And Brian Dean, Head Energy Efficiency and Cooling Energy for All. So thank you for joining us. We are really looking forward to this discussion. I once again invite Ms. Dipa Bagai to kindly talk about some successful solutions that have been implemented on heat and cooling, and what it kind of shows us, the kind of lessons we have learned and how those could be taken forward. And maybe for this segment, Dipa, we speak from here so that we avoid the microphone screaming back. Yeah.
seconds is what I was told. Yeah, it works. So thank you very much, Prima. And it is my honor to join this esteemed panel. I am not an expert like the rest of the people here. So I will start by saying that I have just seen some solutions in the short period that I have been with NRDC. And I've seen them on the ground. And it has both impressed and inspired me. So this is really a personal reflection of what I have seen. And I will look to all of you, we will look to all of you to see how we can move forward this agenda. So since 2011, NRDC and its partners in India had been working to build resilience to heat health related risks. So I was in Ahmedabad, a city of 7 million, and while I was there, I had the chance to see that they had prepared an extensive plan for responding to heat wave challenges. While I was there, Ahmedabad was boiling. I mean, it was boiling. It is especially prone to extreme heat. It suffered a devastating heat wave in May 2010, which is what the authorities told us. I did recall some of that, but when I was there and the temperature in the shade was 43 degrees, they told us that that year it was 46 degrees uniformly for several days. And the institute at which we were, the director of the institute told us that that year they had tracked the number of people who died in that month. 1,300 more people died in that year. That was typical of Ahmedabad over the span of just one extremely hot month. This is all, very local and very anecdotal. But this sobering episode and this terrible human toll of extreme heat motivated the city to initiate development of a stronger and more coordinated response. But that is not as it should be. I mean, you don't want 1,300 people to die for a city to sit up and take notice. I mean, it's like Bob Dylan says, the answer is blowing in the wind. I mean, how many will it take for that to happen? So working with a large number of partners in public health and climate forecasting, and Amit will bear me out, that has become so much stronger than it was earlier. The predictability and the science has become so much stronger. But the NRDC team, along with low-income neighborhood residents, workers, hawkers, medical professionals, set out to develop this first heat action plan. It was in 2013 that the first heat action plan was launched. I mean, it sounds like such a simple, obvious solution, and it's sad that it takes that much for a heat action plan for a city to do that. What is heartening, though, is that now 23 states have heat action plans and 100 cities have those plans. So that kind of scale up is what makes the difference, what shifts the paradigm. But what we need is not just 100 cities and a heat action plan that started in 2013. This is such a moving target. The way the heat is intensifying, it's insidiously creeping up every summer. And the response has to be so much more expansive, so much sharper. And we have made a lot of progress in elevating this problem. In 2015, heat waves were formally recognized as a natural disaster. I was shocked to learn when I was in Ahmedabad that before this it was not considered a national disaster. And a natural disaster. It is a national disaster, but it's a natural disaster. Hazard to life, health and property for the first time by the Indian government. Since then, NDMA has worked very closely with all city and state authorities to strengthen this. And the groundbreaking work in Ahmedabad and the way it has been taken up in other cities, it shows that there are ways that while this climate change impact cannot be avoided, there are ways, equitable and sustainable, that center on public health protection to deal with this. So I'm now just going to talk about a few innovations that I essentially learnt about while I was there. So heat early warning systems and interagency emergency response plans are a key to this. To ground municipal heat responses in strong climate data, IMD is a key leader, the Indian Meteorological Organization Department. It provides detailed temperature forecasts for more than 350 cities. As all of us will know, when we look at our phones now and say, oh, in the afternoon it's going to be 43 degrees. We didn't have that 10 years back. We just didn't have that science to help us cope. Then what also was important in Ahmedabad and has spread to many other places is the promotion of traditional cooling methods and low-cost interventions like the cool roofs I was talking about, expanded urban green islands. These deliver very significant health and environmental benefits. Traditional forms of roofing, cooling used material, earthen, clay tiles, insulating thatched roofs, all this results in significant energy savings and thermal insulation. But this has, one of the things that strikes me when we talk about this is we expect the most marginalized and the most vulnerable sections to be leading this innovation. And that's very tricky. I remember very long ago when I was in the district and we were talking about hollow bricks for building. The lady I was talking about, who was a beneficiary of the poorest housing, for the housing scheme for the poorest, she turned to me and said, "But what kind of bricks do you use in your house?" I will use the bricks, the hollow bricks, if I see you using them. If I see the district magistrate using them, that's when I will start using them. So I think what we have to do is we have to make it aspirational. We have to make it a situation where people want to do this. It has to become fashionable, for want of a better word. And I have to say, one of the things that the Prime Minister has done, the announcing of the Life movement, in some ways it brings a lot of these things together. So, more systematically incorporating heat action plans to advance this lifestyle for environment, to make it part of that lifestyle. This is the kind of thing that will help. And lastly, I want to acknowledge that heat is only one of the climate-related health hazards increasingly threatening people in India and across Asia. The Health Ministry has been doing quite a lot of work trying to integrate this, strengthen public health response to health risks, National Program on Climate Change and Human Health. What we find, and this is again no rocket science, very often the Health Ministry, the Environment Ministry, the Meteorological Department, NDMA, 4 agencies coming together in a room is an extremely challenging task in India. And I'm guessing in other countries as well. So taking a step back, it's clear that even with all that India has done, accomplished on heat adaptation, we need to further strengthen and scale responses at all levels to make our cities and vulnerable communities resilient to extreme heat. The time has come to improve government capacity for city, regional, national actions to address health risk, heat risk as a life and death public health issue. What the secretary there said, he said, heat kills us, but it doesn't have to. And it's not going to have to if we take action about it. So with that focus on strengthening the implementation of of these smart, proven solutions, like we are deploying in many places across India, hopefully other cities around the world, hopefully other cities in India will be better prepared to face these climate-fueled heat waves. And we will be able to help people live better, live in comfort. So at this point, what I'm going to ask all of us is to think about heat not as something that when we are inside an air-conditioned room, the best we say is, okay, let's take off our jackets and bring the temperature to 25 degrees. And that's a very small part of the solution. But if we look at it in a way that is significantly going to change the lives of that hawker, of that construction worker, of that lady who walks across from the slums to my house to work for me, that's when we are going to see the change. So that's the change I hope all of you will help us guide through. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dipa, for sharing the Ahmedabad experience. And clearly, we have to think of heat at all levels and also kind of interweave it into the current policies and programs so that the scale actually happens. I will turn to Mr. Prothi now. Given your vast experience, international and national experience on heat resilience, what do you think it is required for cities to do to build climate to heat resilient infrastructure, and what action is really required at subnational and local level to scale resilience in heat? So over to you, sir. Why don't you take this one?
I think first of all, thank you for having me here. And so I lead the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure, which was set up by the Indian Prime Minister with support of 30 other countries to really bring solutions from around the world and promote more innovation in the disaster resilient infrastructure space. Having said that, I do want to go back to your Dil Pigalta Hai comment. You know, how does your heart melt, right? I've been out of India for about 30 years. And when I left India, you know, heat was always a problem. Delhi, I grew up in Delhi. It was 42 degrees, 40 degrees. I went to school. There was no air conditioning, but we went to school, you know. I worked in an architecture office, and you would be sweating on your drawings, but we coped, right? I come back after 30 years. I'm working at home. It was working from home kind of situation. I have the AC running. It's about 1 o'clock in the afternoon, and my bell rings. And it's I'm lucky enough to live in a house that has a guard, right? And my guard comes and says, his face is completely flush red. Completely flush red. And I said, what happened? And he said, sir, do you have some ice? And I'm sitting there completely embarrassed because here I am having worked around the world, thinking about heat. And here in my own household, somebody who's working outside in a day which turned out to be 47 degrees is suddenly having to come to me to ask for ice, right? That is the reality of the world we are living in. It is dual-faced. The people who have the ability to switch on ACs do, and the people who don't have to look around for support, right? So when you talk about Dil Pagalta Hai, when your heart melts, that moment, that person's face completely red, I'm never going to forget it. And for the rest of the summer, I made sure that there was ice for that person, right? But how do we make that into a systemic change? It's not something that I have to be reminded. It's how do we do it as a normal piece of action. I'm going to turn to this audience. We're talking about extreme heat, right? So how many of you have heard of the term Zoe? I hope all hands go up here. There's 1 hand, 2 hands, 3 hands, 4 hands. Okay. How many of you have heard Katrina, Sandy? Definitely a lot more hands, right? Zoe was the first heat wave named by the city of Seville this summer for a heat wave. Why do I say that? Because we all remember Katrina, we all remember Sandy, and when you have images of that particular event, you understand what is the ramification. So when the government says, you know, we've got a hurricane coming and it's a category 5 hurricane, and it may be like Sandy, it compels you to do something about it. When I say a category 5 heat wave is coming, do you do something about it? Maybe. Category 4 heat wave coming, do you do something about it? Maybe, maybe not. So I want to acknowledge, Kathy Bauman is sitting here from the Archrock Center from Atlantic Council, and naming Zoe for Civil was an initiative that they've been leading. And I just wanted to highlight that as an instant of innovative thinking, right? It's innovative to be able to communicate, because end of the day, we have to be able to communicate about these risks. You're a scientist, I'm an urban planner, you're a fund manager, engineer by background. We already know what heat is to some extent. We are not the ones who we need to communicate to. But the people we need to communicate to, we need to figure out ways of being able to say, here is a reason for you to take action. So communication is incredibly important, right? But that is only in the moment. That's only the instant that one needs to take action. There are certain long-term things we need to address as well. So, again, I'm coming from an urban planning background. When you look at heat, and you've talked about Hyderabad, if you go to Hyderabad, you go to Delhi, you go to any of your city, you realize that heat is not the same across the city. There are certain parts of cities that is definitely 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 degrees hotter than other parts of the cities, right? So when we talk about heat, again, it's not universal across a city. It's actually much more nuanced than that, and we have to understand that. If we understand that, we can do something about it, right? So in your question about, what is it that we want to do? We really want to start to get to understand what are the longer term things that we need to address in the built environment. Now that is both when you talk about cool roofs. Again, cool roofs in a middle income flat is very different than cool roof in a low income slum community. So how do we address that? So I'm blinking all of these examples only to start to say that as CDRI, as the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure, our intention really is to, one, build the evidence. What is the evidence that is needed? For example, again, there's research that shows Delhi will go from a mean temperature that's already 33.4 degrees, from 9.1 days that are at 36.3 average temperature, it's going to be 16.5. So it's going to double by 2050, right? So any city you see, Athens, I worked in Athens, Freetown, Sierra Leone, you start to see that everywhere the extreme heat days are actually going to go much higher under the 1.1 condition. Once you start to accept that we may not be at 1.1, situation gets worse. And there's an economic argument as well. Again, Atlantic Council has put out a report on 13 cities around the world. Delhi is losing something like $3.9 billion already in their worker productivity just in the construction industry. And that's expected to go up to $6.2 billion by 2050. Again, why am I saying that? Because it becomes important to the investor. When you're investing in construction, you're expecting your worker to work. When your worker is not working or not being able to be productive, you're losing value, right? So that is important because that helps to bring the stakeholders and partners, as you mentioned, into the discussion. So again, for CDRI, it's bringing the innovations from around the world so that we can actually do something about it. It's building the right partnerships, and then also starting to see how does one influence this in the short term, so the humanitarian side, but also much longer term, where you're actually saying, okay, how does the built environment need to change so that the urban heat island effect that you're seeing is no longer in existence? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Prothi. Thank you for awakening us to Zoe. And thank you for kind of highlighting that for us. And also the word that built environment, extremely critical, especially in a country like India where we say majority of the buildings that are going to exist in 2030 are yet to be built. So there is real opportunity to talk about including heat and cooling solutions within the built environment. Thank you so much. Now I will turn to the topic of health, very, very closely related to heat. And WHO has highlighted how critical this is when we talk about extreme heat. So I'll turn to Dr. Campbell-Endrum to talk about what is the science and tools that are required for coping or building resilience to extreme heat, and what kind of collaborations are required to do so? Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much first for inviting me here to speak on this really important topic. including in speaking, invited by people who have been some of the pioneers in this work. I'd like to pay tribute to the NRDC and also the Government of India for some of the work they've done on this issue. And just to make clear, you just said now we'll shift to health. From my point of view, we've already been talking about health the whole way through, right from Deputy Executive Secretary Shah saying this is about health, it's about lives lost, it's about deaths. And I think that's one of the things that we need to keep in mind, is that when we're talking about heat and solutions and so on, it's that point of, well, what makes your heart melt? What do you connect to? And if you talk to people around the world, the polling is quite clear in relation to climate change. The things that matter to people are their family, jobs in order to provide for their family. It's not even so much money, it's the jobs to provide for their family adequately and the health of their family. So it's important, even in that discussion about naming disasters and so on, it's part of the personalization of this, part of making it real through stories that's important. And that is why it is important to connect it to health, because it's something that people care about. Another of the reasons why we think as WHO that this is so important is because the evidence is so strong. There is uncertainty about quite a lot to do with climate change on exactly, the downstream impacts. But if you look at the IPCC summary, the latest summary on climate change, there's no real uncertainty around the heat statements. So every one of those statements about the world getting hotter, the exposure getting more extreme, all of those is the highest level of confidence. So if there's one thing we know about the climate crisis and global warming is heat. It's going to get hotter. Another of the reasons to talk about this from a health point of view is that we have compounding risks. So it is getting hotter globally. We also have the urban heat island effect. If you look at the most vulnerable populations to heat, it's older people with pre-existing conditions. So we have a massive multiplier effect. We also know that a gradual increase in temperature of 1.5 degrees and so on sounds like a gradual increase. But if you look at what that does to the frequency of the most extreme heat, even relatively modest warming will multiply the extreme heat stress events by a factor of 20. It's not a 20% increase, it's a factor of 20. And then you're multiplying it by the fact that more people are living in urban areas, in more built-up urban areas with the amplification of the heat island effect. More people are older, more people have pre-existing conditions. And not to mix my disaster metaphors, but that's a tsunami of risk because these things all multiply together. So it's critically important that we act on this. We also have to recognize that there are different vulnerabilities, but in addition to these risks compounding, they also interact with each other. And just to give you a quick story on that, during COVID, which was obviously the main focus of WHO over the last couple of years, we were asking people to do things like to stay indoors or to take protective measures, which were made much more difficult in places where it was really hot, because we're at the same time, if there's a heat wave going on, you may be asking people to go to cooling centres, places with air conditioning where they can be together. So we have this compounding interactive risk. So that's all just to say we think this is incredibly important from a health point of view. That wasn't quite the question you asked me. The question was, okay, what are we going to do about it? What do we need to do about it? And I could talk about research, and we do need more research, but we wouldn't be talking just about the research to characterize the problem. We know there's a big problem. What we're most interested in is applied research. Now, we already know several of the things that we need to do to reduce that risk. And we know them partly through bitter experience, in fact. So we'd heard alluded to the fact that extreme heat kills people, even in Europe. It's relatively hard to kill people in Europe. They're quite well protected by health systems. But the 2003 heat wave, the record temperatures we experienced at that time, led to an excess mortality of about 70,000 excess deaths. And that is in one of the cooler areas in the world with some of the best health systems. Now, we know the problem is much worse the exposures are much worse in low and middle income countries nearer to the equator. We also know that it seems as though that those kinds of events probably don't kill so many people in Europe now. And that's partly because there was a reaction, and we now have heat health warning systems. We have interventions that we know are effective. And this is the point at which I'd really like to commend NRDC, Government of India, because that scaling up of that experience in one really big city in India out to other cities in India is exactly the kind of thing in a vulnerable population, but it's something that's owned by the country that's dealing with it. That's exactly what we want, the kind of thing we want to scale out across the world. And at WHO, we're not resting, sitting back on this. We have a joint office with the WMO. It's one of the few ones in the UN on climate and health. The top priority, or the first priority for that, is heat. And with the support of the Wellcome Trust, we are now upscaling our capacity in this area. We're supporting something called the Global Heat Health Information Network. And one of the things that we'll be doing is, through the support of the Wellcome Trust, to put into place regional resource hubs to support that work in extreme heat. The last couple of comments I'd like to make about what we need in order to do that is also not to just look at the end of the problem. Heat action plans are really important, but if you're in the situation that you have to put into place a heat action plan, it's also because you don't have in place the access to cooling technologies to protect people in the first place, that you haven't dealt with the problem of vulnerability, and ultimately because you haven't dealt with the climate crisis, which, again, Deputy Executive Secretary said the most important thing happening here is to make sure we stick within 1.5 degrees. So we also have to work further upstream, and that's where things like building design is so important, access to appropriate cooling technology. I was very struck with the example of cool roofs. I would suggest that one of the places you really want to put those into place is hospitals, because that's where you have your old, sick people, and it's something which is often under government control, so that would be a really good place for intervention. The final thing I would say, moving slightly upstream, is the importance of urban design. We were chatting a little bit as we came in. Only about a quarter of cities are sort of moderately green. We know that more green space helps to cool cities, helps to relieve some of that pressure, brings a range of other health benefits as well. So we have to support each other all of the way up the causal chain. And at WHO, we're really happy to do that and very happy to work on those kind of broad partnerships. Well, thank you once again for having me.
Thank you so much, Dr. Campbell. And you've raised so many points, and many of those, or all of those points, have been the focus of the work that NRDC and partners have been doing in India. So we understand the importance that you've kind of again reiterated here. As you said, evidence is strong and health is something that people resonate with. And that's what we called, when we first launched the Heat Action Plan in Ahmedabad, it was the Health Risk Communication Plan. But the time is now to go beyond that and kind of take these towards urban cooling action plans, for that matter, and improve access to cooling. So thank you for highlighting those. I will now turn to Seema, and here we know that we need right investments to fast-tracking action on heat and cooling. And what is the role, in your view, that private sector can play in doing that? And how can we best leverage philanthropic and public sources to kind of expand these partnerships?
Is this working? Yeah. Thanks a lot, Prima, and thanks for laying out so nicely the different levels at which we have to apply these solutions. So I'd like to speak at 3 levels where, we need to engage with respect to cooling solutions, and then what is it that we can do from an investment perspective at each of those levels. So the 3 levels that I'll speak to, which have been referenced earlier, are the city scale planning. The second is buildings, at the level of buildings, what can be done. And not by buildings, I don't not just mean high-rise, but also, housing for the urban poor, as well as the rural poor. And then third is the mechanical solutions. So at the level of the cities, obviously the charge of urban planning is with the government. And so public planning and public investments have a critical role to play in this regard. But then the private sector can also play a role in terms of, before I go to the private sector, how the city is planned, whether it is transit-oriented planning or not, are the cities densely planned, is there sufficient cooling space for the citizens? All of those are very critical aspects. But when it comes to the private sector and what it can do, we know that when they are deploying their socially responsible funding, they really want to care about the concrete results. They want to be able to count. And so the trees come in very handy. Time and again, I've seen in India that corporate responsibility initiatives want to go after growing trees. Sometimes even the governments have done that, and pretty successfully. The Delhi government is an example of a government that really has increased the green cover in the city. And yet, the results are not always optimal because they are not always deploying science. They think that traditional knowledge is enough, we know it, and let's do it. But in my previous job at the Nature Conservancy, our scientists showed that which trees are planted, where they are planted, what the tree canopy level is like, all that matters in terms of not just controlling the heat island effect, but also also impacting air pollution to some degree. It won't solve the air pollution problem, but it does help. And also in terms of the groundwater replenishment, and also the problem that we have across many, many developing cities, which is around, flooding when rains happen. So we have to think systematically around all of these solutions, and we have to think about which trees, where they are planted, how they are planted, how ownership models for ensuring that those trees grow will, fall into place. And that's where I think some philanthropies can play a role, not all of them. The one that I work for now thinks about speed and scale, and this is not a solution that scales easily because you have to work at it city by city. But I think still philanthropy can play a role in terms of bringing the science to the table. But eventually it is about, the public sector and the private sectors then uptaking that science and taking it to the scale. Let's now turn to the level of the buildings. At the level of buildings and construction, we have to think about passive solutions first and foremost. What is the design of the building? Which direction is it facing? What should be the size of windows? How much glass we should use or not use, even though it looks attractive, are all important considerations. And there, I think it's very important that the real estate sector, which is a private sector, takes ownership of that problem and begins to deploy solutions. But it's not happening, at least in India, the country that I come from, it's not happening yet. And so one of the ways in which we are trying to change that is an initiative with a civil society organization, which in turn is partnering with a real estate company, a big group called the Lodha Group, and they are developing typologies for consumer needs when it comes to different, passive solutions. What is the ambient temperature that is preferable for different groups of citizens, and how do we then, as Lodha Group, provide the solutions in terms of the offering that we are putting on the market. So that's an initiative where we as a philanthropy have come in to work with a real estate company. The question I always raise with the civil society organization that we are supporting is, how will this scale up? Yes, it's good, it's looking interesting, it's better than, going after the codes, which, you have to pursue city by city by city. Hopefully, if one private sector company like the Lodha Group takes up, then maybe others will follow. And I think this is where the net zero commitments that companies are taking up become very vital. Civil society has a role in pushing the private sector to take on more such commitments and to deliver on them. And philanthropies have a part to play, obviously. Public sector has a part to play, but eventually the role is that of the private sector. We are just catalysts, right? And then let's move to the mechanical solutions, which is around air conditioners. But often we only think about air conditioners, but it's also fans. Let's not forget the simple, plain, simple old fan, for which now there are modern technologies available that would make them hugely efficient. If you look at the stock of fans in a country like India, it's pretty huge, right? A huge population, huge need, and yet also a huge gap. We are going to add an awful number of fans. And there it becomes important for the public sector to create incentives, to create standards, to put a demand on the private sector to comply. But then private sector also has challenges, right? Is the consumer going to be willing to pay the higher costs? How can we bring the costs down by increasing the demand? And there again, the public sector as well as the private sector can step in by ensuring aggregation of demand. And some of that is beginning to happen in some countries, but I think philanthropies, working with civil society organizations, working with autonomous bodies, research institutions, have a critical role to play. Same holds true for air conditioners, where I think most of the conversations are really focused. I mean, the numbers coming out with respect to air conditioners are just astounding. I believe by 2030, the number of air conditioners that India might add would require by 2050, 400 gigawatt of power. Now, how much of investment capital you can save if you brought in the efficient air conditioners, but also there are these super efficient air conditioners, the 5X air conditioner technology, which has been identified through a challenge which several philanthropies have supported, which India hosted. Now we are turning, all of us who care about this issue, to the private sector and saying, go after super efficient air conditioners. But lo and behold, we'll soon be coming out with this 5X air conditioner and switch to that too. So that's not easy for the private sector. Obviously, there's a role that the public sector plays in creating the right incentives. But there's also a role that civil society organizations can play in terms of creating the roadmap for the private sector, working very closely with them. And that's the kind of initiative that philanthropy can support. So at the end of the day, it's very important to recognize that the philanthropies, the private sector and the public sector have to all work together, including the civil society organizations. It's a challenge that requires us all to cooperate. And I'm so grateful to NRDC for bringing us all together to hear each other's perspectives and to enrich our thinking about the way forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Seema. Very rightly highlighted again, built environment and appliances. And you also kind of tee this up for the next speaker, Brian Dean, who's with SE for All. And SE for All has done, through the Chilling Prospects series, quite a bit of analysis on heat and cooling and access to cooling numbers. And some of the numbers there are very, highlight the urgency. So what there are two parts of my question. One is that how do you think what are the absolute essentials of scaling access to cooling? And second is, given your deep expertise in the appliance and energy efficiency sector, how do you think these can be incorporated, and what is the role that energy efficiency is going to play in this whole spectrum?
Okay, great. Great questions. And I think when we think about this Chilling Prospects series that we've done through the years and looking at the vulnerabilities associated with lack of access to cooling, and we see that there's 1 billion people that are, have poverty, that are in very extremely hot locations, and it's 1 billion people that are at what we call high risk due to a lack of access to cooling. There's another 2 billion at risk in medium, and these are the ones that are going to be buying the air conditioners once they become affordable. And obviously there's a huge climate risk associated with that, but these are the people that maybe are not able to actually afford it today, and those technologies are not available in the countries until the governments are doing what's needed to make them more sustainable. So when we think about that 1 billion plus 2 billion, I mean 3 billion people in the world are at high or medium risk due to a lack of access to sustainable cooling. And when we think about then the energy efficiency portion of that and where it is that both traditional, I like this, the city, the buildings, and the actual technologies. This 3 layers really helps you answer what technologies are out there already proven and should be replicated at scale. And when we think about the urban aspect or the built environment, our communities, we've heard about the nature, we've heard about cool roofs. These are 2 real important aspects to reducing that urban heat island effect. Actually, it was in 2019, SE4All had 7 solutions for SDG 7 for achieving sustainable energy for all. Of those 7, 3 were related to cooling. One was the Ahmedabad Heat Action Plan, of course, and that has now been replicated, which is great. Another one was cool roofs. That has then now been replicated through the Million Cool Roof Challenge, and there's been 10 countries and cities within that have found business models that work in the Global South for replicating cool roofs. And then the third of those was Medellin, Colombia, which developed a green corridor through the city and actually dropped the city's temperature by 2 to 3 degrees Celsius. I mean, it's really significant. These nature-based solutions really work. What are we doing now about that? Well, we're actually on Wednesday morning, we're going to launch a Beat the Heat Nature for Cool Cities Challenge. We're going to be working with cities, partners around the world, and cities around the world to actually really start to replicate what we know is proven. We know it's going to help reduce that urban heat island. So when we think about energy efficiency, we first have to think about, okay, how are we going to reduce the actual heat that we as humans face? Well, let's do it at the city scale first. When we're at the building scale, there are some really interesting, also proven, I would say it's new technologies on old proven approaches. And actually in India, the India-Swiss joint program, the Building Energy Efficiency Project, Beep India, they've got actually 2 really interesting projects that I love to get out there further. One of them is, most recently they developed a free-to-use computational fluid dynamics tool. Those have historically been super complicated, only experts can use them, and therefore they hardly ever get used at a building or city scale. So with working with a developer in India, it would be great if they could use this free-to-use tool, which has been built to be simpler and can show when you have air moving through buildings, when you have air moving through neighborhoods, actually it will reduce the cooling that's needed for those buildings. It'll reduce the temperatures within those communities. And so again, this is another free-to-use tool with India's leadership. A lot of this stuff is with India leadership. Quite interesting. It's great. I mean, from Chilling Prospects, we've identified obviously India as one of the critical 9 countries. It is one of the most important countries when it comes to this access to cooling. So that was one of the projects of Beep India. Another one that's really great is they had a challenge or a competition on external shading, external movable shading specifically. And when we're talking about, anybody that's walked around the pavilion here, right? When you're in the shade, you feel significantly cooler. So when you put shade on your buildings, when it's movable, when you can have the daylight coming in the evenings and early mornings, but then you put the shades when it's really hot in the daytime, you want to have really cost-effective shade options. And so this is what this challenge was all about. This competition actually looked at what simple solutions in India can create, can develop external shading for buildings. Another great way to, again, in this building design building design is essential when you get to that. Then when you get to the other technologies in the buildings, obviously insulation was mentioned, the actual air conditioners were mentioned, and the Global Cooling Prize, again, this India-led initiative proved that the manufacturers can create really great technologies, and it can make an impact moving forward. So, energy efficiency is proven across all three of those scales, and there's actual data out there that can, provide showcases to what a city can do, what a building designer can do, and what manufacturers should be doing to comply with the Montreal Protocol and beyond. So, I think that's those are my sort of main takes on it. And we've always said that cooling is not a luxury, but I think we want to afford everyone that luxury of having cooling. So I think this is what this panel has shown, is that we can afford that luxury of cooling, even though it should not be a luxury.
Thank you so much, Brian. Very, very rightly put, and you concluded it very well, affording that luxury of cooling. So yeah, great. I do have one question. I know we are at time, but we did start 15 minutes late. So I think we can take the cue from our previous panel and spend maybe 5 to 7 minutes more. First of all, it's very empowering to talk about heat and cooling on a COP platform and partnering with Global Innovation Hub here at UNFCCC. So the question now is that how do we take this forward between now and the COP 28? So what is your call for action? And that's a question to all the speakers, whoever would want to pitch in.
Maybe I'll just get us started and say that we're working with the UAE to try to make, with the Cool Coalition, to make COP28 a cool COP. So that would be, I think, a really first step, if it can be a cool COP. And the nature-based challenge that we're looking at too, we're hoping to, right now, the challenge will be launched to all cities, follow the playbook, actually make your cities more habitable for your citizens. But we're hoping at COP28 we'll be able to announce actual matching funds for cities that can actually implement those nature-based solutions. So that's, I think, the two things that I think could help scale up. Actually, making the COP cool itself, and then actually if we can deliver funding for nature-based and other cooling solutions. Maybe I'll just pass it on down.
Wow, I don't know what we can do in this short time span that we have. I think better partnerships is what I would say. I find that even in the civil society space, while we are working for shared causes, we work in our own silos. And so the nature-based solution, people are in one little corner doing their thing. And then those who are working on the buildings efficiency do their own thing. People creating the resilience plans for cities are doing their own thing. I've been encouraging our partners to work together. Can we deploy these different solutions in one city? Can we develop a joint initiative somewhere where we are bringing all of these different solutions together so that there's a concrete example created? I mean, obviously it won't get created in 1 year, but if we can come together in a pledge that this is what we'll do, that would be something nice.
I'll take that forward. I think partnerships, clearly. And maybe the target could be, here are 20 interventions. Heat action plan is one intervention, but here is how the building design in a middle class income housing, here's a cool roof in a low income housing, here's a nature-based solution that works at a city scale, which often doesn't include this informal sector, right? I mean, when we talk about nature-based solution, it's about land. And when you think about where land is easily available, it's usually not in the marginal communities, right? So how do we make sure those kinds of solutions are also working in the marginal communities? So I think if we can have 20 such interventions by next year, which should not be impossible if we have the right partnership, that would be my goal.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for this. I think that there's a couple of things. One is that we need to drive this forward, we also have to make sure it's in the language and the incentives that the policymakers understand. I've talked a bit about what people in the street understand, but we also know that money is important, investment cases are important. So it is important to underline this. It's a massive health damage, and it hits on agriculture and so on. Massive economic loss as well. We have a massive loss of productive capacity from people working outside in extreme heat, but also people working inside in extreme heat because they don't have access to that technology. So I think we need to get that argumentation right. I'll just endorse that call for partnerships as well. As I said at the beginning, there's a whole series of things we're trying to do as WHO in the health sector, but I would say almost everything that has been described so far for us is also a health intervention. If you're promoting green cities, if you're getting access to affordable cooling technology, all of that will improve health. So we have a phrase which is health in all policies, but this really is health in all policies. Some of the stuff we should do actively together because it directly relates on our areas of influence. So that's why I'm talking about things like solar energy and appropriate cooling technologies for healthcare facilities and hospitals. That's a direct collaboration. Some of it is just sort of supporting each other to say, well, we can't do that. Doesn't directly relate, but we're really glad you're doing that and backing each other up. And on a final note on that is it's great that UAE is talking about the next COP being a cool COP. They're also talking about it being a healthy COP as well. I don't think those conflict. A healthy, cool COP. I like cool COP sounds cooler, but I think healthy is also really important and they don't conflict. So we're very happy to play our role in that partnership as well. Thank you.
So this call for action that has come from 1, 2, 3, 4, and the expectation from this room, coming from here, I think as NRDC India, I would like to say that we are committed to take this forward. I think the time is for action, and I think everybody here has something to contribute. The trifecta of policy, technology, and finance is all sitting right here. We don't need anything else but to take this forward. I love the idea of bringing it to one place and showcasing it in the way it's possible. I think we will try and do it. We commit that we will come back to the cool COP with some really cool solutions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dipa. So healthy, cool COP28 with partnerships and pledges to get there. So thank you for that. And I will turn to Manish now for final word for call for action.
Just to say a huge thank you to all our panelists. Incredibly rich conversation around really identifying practical solutions, the why, the what, and the how. But the thing that really struck me about today's conversation is not only the importance of understanding what we need to do and how we need to scale, but it was the power of story and the need for all of us to be able to actually tell stories to others that aren't here in order to animate and energize. And I just want to close with a very quick story, or actually an email I received a few months ago, and I'm going to read you the email. This was one of those emails that it makes your heart truly melt. And it came from the head of an organization called SEWA, the Self-Employed Women's Association in Gujarat. And many of you may have heard about it. It's probably the largest women's organization in India and one of the largest in the world. And it was May 13th of this year. Greetings, hope you are well and safe from the multiple risks we are all facing. We all have still not come out fully from the pandemic. The climate crisis is worsening. Currently, there's a severe heat wave with temperatures recorded at 52 degrees Celsius. 52 Celsius. Never in our history we've experienced such severe, harsh heat. And remember, SEWA is an organization of 3 million women living in villages in Western India. The members of SEWA, the salt pan workers working in the desert in the scorching heat, they live in the desert. For these salt pan workers, it's impossible to work after 10 a.m. This reduces their working hours, directly affecting their income. The government is supplying water through tankers every alternate day, but it's stored in cement tanks in the open. The water is also hot. The food cooked gets spoiled. The hot winds keep blowing continuously, making it unbearable. Similarly, the street vendors, construction workers, and waste collectors are also in very precarious situation. The hours they can work is reduced. This directly affects their income. They suffer from heat stroke with fever, vomiting, and diarrhea. For vegetable and fruit vendors, the vegetables and fruit get spoiled quickly. They suffer big losses. There's a need for cool boxes to store drinking water, vegetables, and fruits. They need protective shelters. They need ORS, oral respiration salts, to keep the workers hydrated, and need for proper water supply, solar fans, solar water coolers. And it was this just incredible out of the moment, right, recognition of what the reality is. And I say that not only as kind of what the reality is, but what the opportunity is. And this slide that we had in the background is actually from Jodhpur, a city that also hit 52, 53 degrees a few months ago. But it shows women painting the roofs white, and just something as simple as that as taking a step forward. So as we take the run up to the cool, healthy COP at 28, I think we all need to be not only focused on the solutions, but we need to be storytellers. We need to communicate the stories of those that aren't here, what is happening and what we need to do to support them in this better future. So with that, thank you to all of you for the roles that you're playing, and to all of us for the hard work that we have in the year ahead. Thank you all.